Introduction. Firstly, my name is Dr. Yaqub Ahmed. I am a lecturer at Istanbul University's Theology İlahiyat department. I want to say thank you very much to everyone who is here today, whether that is the morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. We are really pleased and privileged today to have Professor Bruce Lawrence with us from Duke University. And I mean, the one thing I would like to say, when I was thinking about the bio, Professor Bruce Lawrence has written so much work that it was very difficult for me to pick anything out in particular that I could highlight. I do want to stress that in my own classroom, I use his work from Hajj to Hip Hop. It's the class that I teach in terms of Islamic civilization, which I found interesting. And so what I'm going to do is just present Professor Lawrence to you very briefly, and then I will open the floor to him. Just housekeeping rules, it will be 40 minutes to 45 minutes of the presentation, and then 15 to 20 minutes the Q&A, depending on how it works out. Please raise your hand for the Q&A section or write in the box. Also, please have your mics on mute in that context. Okay, so Professor Bruce Lawrence obtained his undergraduate degree at Princeton University, his master's degree at Episcopal Theological School, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and his doctorate at Yale University in History of Religions. Since his time in academia, Professor Lawrence has written a host of works on Islam, the Islamicate and Sufism, as well as religions or traditions of Asia, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. His study of subjects related to Islam have not been restricted to the Arab world, but also the Asian subcontinent and the Ottoman and Persianate spheres of influence. He's fluent in Arabic, Urdu, Persian, and French, as well as teaching Islamic history at Duke University for almost 40 years. He has also taught at Üsküdar University in Istanbul and Ibn Khaldun. A key theme that I have found interesting, as I said, in Professor Lawrence's ideas has been on the notion of Muslim networks, the significance of Muslim elites, the conceptualization of the idea of empires, as well as the transition between the pre-modern and modern. Over the course of his career, Professor Lawrence has explored the central element of Islamicate civilization, and as I mentioned, Muslim networks. The idea of the Islamicate, found in the works of Marshall Hodgson, is starting to become used more and more within the field of Islamic studies. And so it pleases me to have one of the pioneers in terms of explaining how the term Islamicate is becoming more and more prevalent. Professor Lawrence points to the resilience of Islam, to its cosmopolitan character, and it is from this position that he shall discuss some of his thoughts and ideas today. We at Istanbul University's İlahiyat department would like to thank you for accepting our invitation today and look forward to hear from you in terms of your thoughts and ideas. Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence. You might want to unmute Professor Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Yaqub. Now that I'm unmuted, I hope I can get through all this thing technically. So I have you on now. I've got to get my own, there it is. So I'm so glad you mentioned From Hajj to Hip Hop, because it was a work that I was also pleased to do with my wife, and we have really enjoyed the aftermath of that book and the discussions that it's provoked. And so that was almost 20 years ago, and now there's this latest book of mine, Islamicate, Cosmopolitan Spirit, the cover of which is the first slide. And I wanted to explain it.
Professor Lawrence, we're going to need you to show the slide again. It seems to have left our screens, I think. Is there a way you can do that again?
And can you see that?
I can't see it. Can anyone else see it?
You can't see the...
No, we seem to have lost your PowerPoint.
Miriam, we lost the PowerPoint.
So
if you like, I can open and share the screen for you and give me a sign, and I change the slide for you as well.
I think that might be better, because
okay,
we just seem to be going back and forth here.
It's not a problem. So if you can upload the PowerPoint, please.
Tamam hocam. Wait a second.
I'm sorry about the technical difficulties.
Don't be sorry. This is a regular thing that happens on Zoom, so we're all accustomed to it.
Can you see it now?
No.
Wow.
Let me see if I can do it.
I'm sorry.
Okay, let me try. Maybe I can do it.
You can, if you can.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can do it. Let me try.
Oh, now I see something on the screen.
Oh yes. Okay. So if you can just click on the slide.
Yes.
Slide. That's the one. Yeah. And then. Okay, the floor is all yours, Professor.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much for your agility, not only for your intellectual insight, but for your technical skill in getting this picture on the screen. So I should just say, looking at this particular cover of this book, that it was not a book I could have imagined 20 years ago. In fact, when I was teaching at the full-time at Duke University, which I did until 2011, I've been retired now for a decade, but also teaching elsewhere, including above all in Istanbul. But the thought I had in mind was that I would write something on Muslim cosmopolitanism, thinking that Muslim was an adequate term. And then I began to explore different avenues of thought and realized it would be better to do my book on Islamic cosmopolitan. And I had thought about that for a while until I really began to engage what were the implications of Islamic and Muslim as key terms in the second decade of the 21st century. And I began more and more to think about the importance that Hodgson had played in my own life and the key term Islamicate, and how it had disappeared and then it suddenly started to reappear and started to reappear more insistently in works that I looked at. So I found myself moving from thinking I wanted to do something on the depth to Islamicate over the course of 2 decades. And I think to explain really what clinched it was, there was a conference to note 50 years, that is half a century since Hodgson's death. He died in 1968, so this conference was in 2018 at Yale Law School. And I was asked to be a respondent on a panel with several people who are major scholars in the field. And they all said, well, Hodgson's really great because he has this term Persianate, but Islamicate is faded. This is only 4 years ago at a very major university, Yale, at a law school symposium dedicated to Hodgson. So that challenged me to think, if here is a group of scholars, very esteemed and well-known and widely regarded people who are rejecting Islamicate but favoring Persianate. And I went back and re-examined it and thought, I'm not going to publish this manifesto until I see if Islamicate can be usefully introduced. And so I found myself rethinking Islamicate, and as you could tell in the book, putting it in the central place of Islamicate and Islamicate cosmopolitan and the Islamicate cosmopolitan spirit as being the 3 key terms. And I talk a lot about key terms, key words, and their significance in writing this book for Wadley Blackwell. And I think the thing which has surprised me, but which I now recognize, is that many people read it thinking it'd be like my other books, even as Jacob had mentioned, From Hodge to Hip Hop, which essentially are analytical books thinking about broader themes. And this is not so much an analytical book. This is more what I would call a primer. It's almost a kind of idea book that is a sampler of various traditions and not an inclusive or comprehensive history. And so I intended to make this a provocative book with points of interest, but not an exhaustive treatment of any subject, especially the subject of Islamic or Islamicate civilization over the course of history. So the major person, next slide, please, who's the antecedent to Hodgson, is Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. And when I was writing this book, I was thinking very much of my own work, when I began, I studied the Muqaddimah with the person who translated, who's most renowned for translating into English, a scholar named Franz Rosenthal. Since I did my work at Yale, Professor Rosenthal, Franz Rosenthal was one of my teachers. And one of the things he said about the Muqaddimah is that it's a book that could never be translated, but it can be interpreted. So he himself was very humble, and he says at the very beginning that all translation is an artifice. It always pretends to translate what really can't be translated. And he noted that the term Umran was not simply speaking civilization, but in one sense, the broader world or the ecumene. So he found himself actually using Hodgson's terms, which is ecumene, that the Umran is not just simply that is the world as it exists for civilization, but the world as it exists in a planetary mode, almost anticipating the conversations we now have about planetary history or Anthropocene history. So when I was revisiting the Muqaddimah and thinking about its significance, I recognized that Ibn Khaldun also plays with binaries. He plays with notions of two. And so even as I looked at the whole question of how to think about civilization, there's Umran Hadawi and Humran Badawi. Humran Hadari is what people call civilization, and Humran Badawi is what people call barbarian life. But actually in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, and also in the thinking of Professor Rosenthal, and in my own speculation about Hodgson, you don't have simply civilized and uncivilized. You have two different versions of what it is to be civilized. And one is urban, and the other is rural or non-urban in nature. So instead of saying you have to choose, or you always have the restriction of one or the other kind of civilization, you have always in tension, but always together, Humran Hadari and Humran Badawi. And there's a sense in which neither can exist without the other. And so it's this play between these two kinds of Umran that led me to think about Barzakh. And that's the final word that comes up at the end of my description of key terms, is that Barzakh, or Barzakh logic, which of course comes from the Quran, the whole notion that there are two different spheres. Between them, there is a Barzakh which allows them to be connected, but not one to be implicated or totally absorbed by the other. So I found this whole notion of Barzakh, which I'd used in one of my earlier books, in a book called Who is Allah, but also in earlier other books, I had talked about Barzakh and Barzakh theory. But in this book, I call it Barzakh logic. And I go back to Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, but also to Marshall Hodgson's The Venture of Islam. So could I have the next one, please? So there's a sense in which this book, by the very word Islamicate, is kind of a tribute, but also a correction to Hodgson. It's a tribute to him because it takes the term Islamicate, but then it spins it in a direction which covers the 21st as well as the 20th century. And Hodgson himself died in 1968. So he anticipated what he called the high technical age, but he only lived through the very early part of it. And it's sometimes hard to describe how somebody who died so young could have produced such an enormous work. And of course, the answer is he was lucky to have a good friend who was able to outlive him, but also to subordinate his own scholarship to Hodgson. His name is Reuben Smith. And so in 6 years after Hodgson's demise in 1968, this person, Reuben Smith, was able to put together the notes that had been The Venture of Islam and to publish it in 3 volumes. And the one person who characterized Hodgson as an individual was the American novelist Saul Bellow, who wrote a book called To Jerusalem and Back, where he said about Hodgson, he was somebody always, this is almost metaphoric or poetic in nature, soaked in his subject, thoroughly pedantic. That is, he loved words and loved language. He had no informal manner. He was not a social animal. He was more what some people might call a geek today. He was always and everywhere the same, earnest, theoretical, high-minded. And I like this last attribute, the most important of all, stubbornly virtuous. And I think the quality of him as somebody who was not only intellectually gifted and driven, but also stubbornly virtuous is what permeates the 3 volumes of the Venture of Islam. Next one, please. So in course of my career teaching, I began back in the 70s. So I began now approaching 50 years ago, teaching the Venture of Islam, but introducing it to students by indicating that it was supposed to be a work that you did not read from cover to cover, but you read selectively. And I stress the fact that you read it beginning with the notion that Hodgson himself puts it in 3 volumes because he's trying to think of the scope of Islam over the course of centuries. And he's trying to think of Islam, and this is something which now everyone takes for granted, but as a world civilization. So he has, the title is The Venture of Islam, but the subtitle is Conscience and History in a World Civilization. So most people don't have any problems with thinking of history and world civilization, but they have a great deal of problem thinking of what is conscience and what does he mean by conscience. And I will explain later that I think this relates directly to the concept of adab, which he accents again and again in his work. And it's not technically speaking a translation of conscience, but it's an ethical mindedness, a conscious awareness of ethical demands that for him infuses Islam as a world civilization. And he really is emphasizing world civilization across time and space, which I will indicate in the subsequent things. But notice that he doesn't talk about the formative age. He talks about the classical age, the age when Islam becomes a classical form of expression of human endeavor. The next one, please. So volume 2, he is being teleological in the sense that he's spanning what he calls, following Karl Jaspers, the axial period, where Islam culminates a whole series of changes that have taken place in the organized history of humankind, as it's been documented through the works in several languages, including obviously Greek and Latin and Hebrew and Arabic, but also Persian and later Turkish, Urdu, and Swahili, as well as Bahasa Indonesia. So he talks about in volume 2, the venture of Islam and the expansion of Islam, not in the medieval period, but the middle periods. Again, classical, middle, and then modern. He's very intent upon not doing what has been called the Ternary Myth. Abdallah Laoui, the Moroccan theorist, talks about the Ternary Myth, which is that you have primitive, medieval, modern, and that means, of course, that modern is always the best. And Hodgson is trying to argue that there's no teleological view of history in general, and Islam in particular should be not segmented into the formative and the medieval and the modern, but it should be seen as a classical, which holds up a certain standard, in the middle, which expands that, and the modern, which is another expression of the classical and middle. Next, please. So the third one, and this is where one begins to get into the notion that Hodgson is not only a scholar of history and philosophy and literature, but also of economics and science. He coins the term gunpowder empires to describe what is the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal, which he prefers to call the Indo-Timurid because it's not related so much to Mongols as it is to Timurids who ventured into India and became known as the Mughal Empire. So he talks about the gunpowder empires and sees them as indissolubly, as seamlessly weaved into the modern period. And above all, in volume 3, when I've taught this, people are very surprised to find that Hodgson exactly and insistently refutes the idea of decline thesis. Most people now agree with him that there was not so much a decline as there was an explosion of a new format of being modern or being excellent and having economic and political as well as military and cultural superiority in the modern world. But it was not a notion of inherent superiority. It was a matter of changes that seemed very minor at the time, but had major consequences over longer periods of time. So when he talks about, and this is the most controversial of all the 3 volumes, the first one most people accept, the second one people have tried to expand, but the third one people say, well, couldn't he have said some more about, for instance, Southeast Asia Well, he actually says quite a bit about what is called Islam under the winds, the Ummah under the winds, or Archipelago, or Nusantara Islam. He says quite a bit about it, but he's writing in the 1960s when most people still thought of Islam as centered in the Mediterranean world, and some people even more narrow thought of it centered in the Arab world. So he expanded between the notion of Islam as an Arab entity and the Western world as being the flag carrier of modernity. So he's going against two, this is over 50 years, he's going against two received opinions. One is that Arabs define Islam, and if you know about Arabic and you know Arabs, then you are defined everything that has to do with Islam. But the other side of this is when the West arises and the West becomes a dominant colonial and imperial, and then finally a transhistorical and transoceanic force, when that happens, the modern times become Western times. So Hodgson is fighting both against the Arabist bias and the Western bias in volume 3. Next, please. So I've used a lot of terms that have been what I would say more temporal, referring to time, but I really think you have to be spatial. One of the major surprises I had when I published this book, when it came out, which was just last October, only less than 6 months ago, was I got a message from Professor John Woods at the University of Chicago. And he said, we have begun this thing called the Chicago School of Islamicate Studies, and we're now going to use your book as one of the major texts. And I said, why? He said, well, because it fits with this map. And then this is Professor Wood's map that he sends me. He said, we have devised a map of Islamicate spheres, and you have described it in your book. Well, I have to confess that this map does a better job than my book does of looking at the geographic expanse of what I call Islamicate cosmopolitan spirit. And what I could, and I'm really wanting to leave time for questions and answers, so I could spend the whole rest of the half hour on this map, but let me just show you two things about it, which will repay your revisiting it. One is you notice that there's no Middle East. Now, to those of you who come from Istanbul and from Central Asia and Turkey and think about the world from the middle part of what is the Afro-Eurasian ecumene, it'd be no surprise that I don't use the term Middle East. But for most people, when you're talking in a Western, European, British, or American, or even Canadian audience, and you say there's no Middle East, they think that you have forgotten your vocabulary, that of course there's a Middle East and there's a Near East and everyone knows about it. But Hodgson insisted, this is over 50 years ago, the Middle East is a colonial term. That if you're going to really do world history and you're going to think about Islam in an idiom that crosses the ecumenical sphere, you have to call it by a name that's the history, and that name is Western Asia. So number one here for Hodgson is Western Asia, not the Middle East, not the Arab world or the Eastern world, but the Western part of Asia. And then he has other parts of Asia, Western Asia, South Asia, Central Eurasia, Southeast Asia. So you notice that Asia is in 4 different terms there. Turkey does not come up, but it comes up in Anatolia and the Balkans because it's a description of the area, not different names. Iran comes up, but linked to the Caucasus. There's not the Maghreb, but there's North Africa and Southern Europe because, of course, in the pre-modern period, Al-Andalus or southern Spain was linked to North Africa. And then you have West Africa, East Africa, and the Indian Ocean. I could spend, as I said, the next part talking about why these different areas are all important, but simply to note that from the University of Chicago, which is where Hodgson taught, they now have a revised notion of what it is to teach global history and to take account of the Muslim world, and they do it under the notion of spheres of Islamicate studies. Next one, please. And so I just wanted to use one other map from Professor Woods and then pass on quickly to other points. Most people say the histories that have been written are the histories of land, of the conquest by land, and you all know the history of Islam expanding to the west and to the east, and the notion of the different armies, the Arab armies, and then combined Arab, Persian, and Islamic armies that went across North Africa, and of course, the expanse of Asia all the way out to Southeast Asia. But what is less well known and not so well documented are the networks. To use Yaqub's phrase, Muslim networks is what he was, or one of the books to which he was first introduced to me, the one that my wife and I did called Hajj to Hip Hop. And the point of that Hajj to Hip Hop is that networks that have always been Muslim have also been maritime. They've also involved water. And of course, the green thing is the Mediterranean. And you all know about the Mediterranean because, of course, that includes the Black Sea and includes Istanbul and all of the Mediterranean to the west of Istanbul. But there's also the east. And the east goes not only down past the Arabian Peninsula, but goes out to the Indian Ocean and all the way across to Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean. So if you look at this map, and again, I could spend a long time on it, but just simply to note that there are trade circuits, and these trade circuits show a connected world all the way from Africa, from southern Spain, what used to be Andalus, and Al-Maghrib, all the way down to the end of the Indian Ocean in what is called Islam Nusantara. So that's simply an expansion of Hodgson's map, both temporally and spatially. Next one, please. So I've raised a number of issues, but I haven't talked about people who have reacted to Hodgson, and some people have reacted by applauding him and some by modifying him. A person who does both, who both uses Hodgson and tries to modify him, is the late scholar Shahab Ahmed, who taught most of his career at Harvard University, and also, like Hodgson, died very young, unfortunately, of a brain injury that took him when he was only in his late 40s. So this is Shahab Ahmed, and he's famous for having written a book, next one, please, called What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, which came out posthumously 2016 because he died just before the book came out over almost 6 years ago now. So what is Islam? The importance of being Islamic. He tries to argue that the term Islamicate is a secular term. And I myself have said in print, and I say it again here in my manifesto, that it's a misreading of Hodgson. It's not so much that that Islamicate is secular, as it expands the sweep of Islamic culture beyond the religious, the things that involve arts and practices that are local and not linked at all to the origins or early development of Islam. So I both applaud Shahab Ahmed and myself criticize him, recognizing the importance of this book, but also its limits. Next one, please. So for those of you who don't know the book, I thought I should just have a one slide that just simply tells you, this is a book that's 600 pages and I only have 3 or 4 minutes, so it's going to be very brief, but it's what would be called in descriptive terms a deconstructive theory, deconstructing what exists, of what he thinks has not been adequately stressed, which is a cosmopolitan perspective. So my approach and Shahab Ahmed's both agree in accenting cosmopolitan. Where we disagree is he would say it's Islamic cosmopolitan. I would say it's Islamicate cosmopolitan. So beyond key term biases and disciplinary boundaries, he tries to think of what is Islam in 3 parts, which includes its pretext, that is what happens before the text, and obviously with a play on the word pretext, which can be the presupposition for doing something, but pre-colon text, pre-apostrophe text, and then in the text itself, which are many texts, obviously the Holy Quran, but also many other instances of key writings, and principally in Persian, which is the language he prefers to talk about at length in his book. And the context, what is the context in the early parts of Muslim expansion, and then the later parts. And the one phrase that he uses time and again, which people have both accented and discussed at length, is coherent contradictions. And again, if I had a long period of time, I could describe to you his coherent contradictions. But the one, because all of you know some Arabic and some Persian, is he uses the expression madhab-e-ishq. So madhab is obviously referring to a school of law, but it's an embodiment of a kind of thing that is like the discipline of a school of law and the rules and expectations of a school of law, but it's madhab-e-ishq. And ishq, of course, is not one of the madhahib or traditional schools of law. It's an evocation of the longing for God that is characteristic of Irfan or Sufism. So he talks about this as coherent contradictions in the very term madhab-e-ishq, which is madhab law, and ishq, which is love, which is not law. So he talks about these coherent contradictions as one sense contradictory, but also coherent. And as if to put a play on this notion, he dedicates his book for my parents who raised me in the Islam of their cosmopolitanism and the cosmopolitanism of their Islam. And there have been several reviews of this book, but no one has looked at how ironic and how difficult is this notion of Islam of cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitanism of Islam. The key term, obviously, is cosmopolitanism, because cosmopolitanism shapes Islam, and Islam in turn reinforces cosmopolitanism. So the irony is that he is unhappy with Hodgson's use of Islamicate, but he himself, Shahab Ahmed, fails to explain what is cosmopolitan. Next. So for those of you who want to have some kind of summary of what I'm discussing with reference to Hodgson and Shahab Ahmed and myself, Hodgson, I never use this term, but Hodgson uses the term Islamdom to describe the whole realm of the Muslim world, and Islamicate civilization as the expanse of Islamdom. So Islamdom, if you will, is the geographic term. Islamicate civilization is a descriptor of what takes place within Islamdom. And for Hodgson, that begins before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad and begins before the early period of Islam. It begins really under the Byzantine and Sasanian empires in 500 and extends up to 1950. Hodgson, not realizing that his own demise was close at hand, that Ajal was about to overtake him, he just simply thought 1950 is a good date to end. So he does a period of history of almost a millennium and a half, where he talks about Islamdom and Islamicate civilization. Shahab Ahmed, by contrast, ignores the whole early period of Islamicate history and starts in 1300 because he says that's when great poetry arises, and poetry and the movements that are described as Sufism. But of course, there are great Sufis and great thinkers and great developments in Islam that precede 1300. But for Ahmed, the key term is cosmopolitanism, and he only sees this cosmopolitanism coming up in the later middle period, 1300, and then ending in the late modern or the middle modern period, 1850. So he takes as his whole time frame and also his geographic frame from Balkans to Bengal and from 1300 to 1850. I feel this is too narrow, and so my own thing is to go back to Hodgson and say 500, but to expand Hodgson another 70 years and to talk about the Islamicate cosmopolitan spirit from 500 to 2020. Next one, please. So I thought this map would help clarify it. It should have a couple of accents on it. Yeah, so the Nile to Oxus is the first period for Hodgson, is the Nile to Oxus rivers. He accents the maritime importance of these two rivers. In expansion, you can see them very clear in the map. And then there is the contrary view of Ahmed, which is Balkans to Bengal, that cuts across the Nile to Oxus. But notice it also leaves out all of Arabia, leaves out all of North Africa, and of course doesn't go down to Southeast Asia. Balkans to Bengal, obviously it's wonderful, it includes Istanbul, but even if you're a Istanbulite, you would not want to exclude other parts of Islamicate history when you're talking about the broadest range of a civilization that goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific and is the Afro-Eurasian ecumene, according to Hodgson. And the next one, please. So one person who does go from the Maghreb to Nusantara, from Northern Africa to Southeast Asia, is Clifford Geertz. And many people have said, well, isn't Geertz a corrective to Ahmed? Unfortunately, and I'm an admirer of some parts of Clifford Geertz, but I think this is what I would call the reductive approach, because he says, look how different Islam is here. I'm pointing to the far left, how different it is in West Africa, Northwest Africa, and how different that is from Islam in Southeast Asia. So Geertz's whole point is not to say there is this cumulative civilization which has many different ports of entry and many different emphases that could be highlighted. He says instead, look how different it is from North Africa, the Maghreb, to Southeast Asia, and Java. He looks at all the Santa, but especially the island of Java, which of course is where he did his own research. So I think this is what I would call a false sense of exclusivity. And I come back, go ahead. And I come back to Hodgson because I want to have some time. So I'm going to do this a little bit faster. There are flaws in Hodgson, but I still think the Great Western Transmutation is a better descriptor of modernity than its alternatives. Next one. Hodi Johannes Lamalu. For those who don't know this Turkish scholar, she taught in America for a long time, but she's now back in Istanbul. I think she's just next door to in Istanbul, Boğaziçi, and she is a wonderful economic scholar who also studied Hodgson. This is her at a 2014 conference. Next one, please. And she did this essay in A Companion to World History. Next one, please. Chapter 30 by her. This is another Wiley Blackwell book, which also has a chapter on Hodgson.
It seems like Bruce Hodges' internet has frozen. Okay, well, let's just give Bruce Hodges a few minutes to come back into the Zoom session. It seems like his internet has frozen, but I don't think he has many more slides left. So if you guys have any questions, please do have them ready and prepared so that we can click on from that. If you're unwilling to ask the question in person, just write it into the chat and then we will read them out, hopefully. So let's just hope that Professor Lawrence can, there he is. If we can unmute him, he's back. Ready to roll?
Here we go. I'm unmuted, I think.
You're back, Professor Lawrence. We can hear you.
Oh, here we go. So here we can I can do this really quickly. So the question that Hodi asked, which is the same question Hodgson asked and that I pursue in my writing, is how do you get rid of binaries like West and non-West? First of all, you get rid of the Middle East. I don't mean you get rid of it technically, but you don't talk about it. You talk about Eurasia or Western Asia. You don't talk about West and East. And you challenge the idea that modernity is limited to the West. Next one. So all regions are involved. And so the question is, what are the specific trajectories that define one region as different from another? Next, please. So this again is a map to show the 1700 that Islam had not disappeared. In fact, it expanded in different parts of the world with different emphases. Next one, please. And so my simple point at the end of this all is if you have to accent particular notions, elites matter. They don't always dominate. Bureaucrats, warriors, merchants, and scholars are trying to exercise what Hodgson calls the ethos of adab, and that's empires are where they pursue the moral life, following the Mongol invasions that are marked by Persianate norms within an Islamicate society. Next one, and modernity matters everywhere. Final one. So Hodgson's a product of the Cold War in the 60s, fighting the demons of Western exceptionalism and anti-communism. We have a new age of connectivity. We're definitely living out the high-tech era that he talked about, the high-tech era that he'd merely imagined, but we now live it out. And what is that? Persianate trajectories are expanded. Islam has new elites, and Islamicate cosmopolitan spirit and its Persianate ethos are still evident. Thank you. So let me take questions now.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence. We really appreciate that. So as the chair, the moderator, I have just two really short questions for you. The first one is that in regards to the term Islamicate, now I'm using this term more and more, and I never agreed with Shahab Ahmed's idea that it's a secular term. I actually thought it was quite inclusive in explaining the phenomena of looking at how Muslims and Muslim societies or the Muslim world or whatever you want to call it, non-Muslims including, how they were influenced by Islam, not simply just by law, but by this particular phenomena of living in this world, which we call Islamic. And I thought that the term Islamicate is an apt word to help us understand that phenomena. And so I was thinking, why is it that there is a point where the Islamicate the term doesn't gain some popularity, and now all of a sudden more and more scholars are starting to use it again? Why do you think that's happening? And the second question, you didn't include North America. I wanted to know why North America in particular is missing in your map. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Yakub. So let me just say that the hardest thing for any scholar is to look at oneself. So if I have to look at North America, I have to look at myself and say, why am I in this morass called the United States, Canada, Mexico? We even had an ex-president who thought he could take care of drugs by lobbing weapons at Mexico and taking care of the problem by military means. So there's a strange thing that America, first of all, I really resist calling America just the United States. So I always want to think of Canada, and I want to do a major call out to say that the difficulty with writing about Islam in America is that most people, when they write about Islam in the United States. But there actually are Muslims in Mexico. There's an Islamicate culture in parts of Mexico, and certainly in Canada. But that's a big subject, and it's one in which I have written a little bit, but not a lot. So I avoid it because I think there's so much else in the world outside of America, and I don't believe myself in either Western exceptionalism or American privilege. So you might say that I'm avoiding the real demon in the closet, but I recognize the demon and say, let it stay in the closet for a little while longer. So looking across the term, at the use of the term Islamicate and why it's more recent now, and some people like it and some people don't. I've had so many discussions with people, including good friends of mine, who say, the difficulty with talking about Islamicate is that when you write, in fact, if you did this and just checked it out, you tried to write Islamicate Cosmopolitan ethos, you get a corrector saying Islamic. So in the digital age, we don't yet have Islamicate as part of the technical vocabulary. So that's one of the reasons it's so difficult. I'm doing another book, believe it or not, another very big book with a friend of mine, Vincent Cornell, whom I mentioned, Mansour al-Mujahid. He's a Muslim convert. His name is Mansour al-Mujahid, and he's a professor at Emory University. And Mansour or Vincent said to me, you know, I really like your book, Islamic Cosmopolitan Spirit. I said, Vince, it's not Islamic, it's Islamicate. And he said, you know what? He said, I tried to write that, but my computer wouldn't let it come up. So Yakub, you're ahead of the computer age. So you have to keep insisting that Islamicate is not the same as Islamic. But until we get a retracting software system that says Islamicate is equal to Islamic or can be used instead of Islamic, there's going to constantly be the correction going back to Islamic. So I think old words, and Hodgson, of course, knew this better than anybody, that old terms die slowly. And he was never happy with the term Islamicate. He said, I hope somebody invents something better. But his whole process of thinking about Islamicate was to say that Islam is something that is both religious and cultural. And the problem with Shahab Ahmed says, if you use Islamicate, you're not saying the cultural over the religious, you're making it secular. And I think that was his own predisposition, but it was not Hodgson's and certainly not mine. So I try to use it. And what's really remarkable to me is the number of people when I go out someplace and I'm talking and I do a slip myself as I do and talk about Islamic civilization. I'll have usually a younger person in the audience say, excuse me, Professor, but you did mean Islamicate, didn't you? And I self-correct and say, yes, I meant Islamicate. So the answer is, in generations, I think this is really true, that in generations, the younger generation, and I know even though you're a Dharibala with a gray beard, you're still younger than I am, that the younger generations, including people in their 50s and their 30s, and now people who are just in their 20s, they take the term Islamicate as a window of opportunity. They see a benefit in using Islamicate as something broader, more expansive, and not reductive, and not secular, and not argumentative. So I think the reason this is coming up, and this is a really big subject, but I do believe that one of the things that Hodgson really accented very strongly was we're moving into a time of what we now call planetary history or Anthropocene age. When it's not just people and animals, it's people and the climate. It's the North and South. The ecumene is not just Afro-Eurasia, it's also the North and South Pole. And if you think in more global terms and think about interplanetary history, Islamicate does much better as an accent for this larger arc of what I say is Persianate for some people, but Islamicate in the broadest sphere, including, of course, sub-Saharan Africa and many parts of Southeast Asia. So I think Islamicate is coming back because world history is expanding to planetary history. And if you're going to do a planetary history, you have to use terms that are novel in the way in which planetary and Anthropocene are novel terms, and Islamicate better suits that, in my view.
Thank you very much. I mean, like myself as an Ottoman historian, I mean, the late Ottoman period is always seen within these binaries of the secular and the Islamic. And so, for example, Ottomanism as a concept has always been presented as secular. And I've started to make the argument, could Ottomanism be the Islamicate, as a way of trying to make sense of how the transition is taking place within the Islamization of something which is seen as positivism in that sense. And so for me, the term has, I mean, I agree with you to some degree. I'm still negotiating with it, but I find it an apt term that I can use right now as a way of explaining the phenomena of those gray areas, those areas of shade, which don't actually have a direct term that we academics often require as a way of explaining phenomena. And I think in that sense, the Islamicate is inclusive enough to include that. So that's something I'm negotiating with right now.
Well, I hope you're right on it. I should just answer you back by saying, not only do I appreciate seeing Malcolm X behind you, but I appreciate having you as a new face of a Malcolm X version of Ottomanism, trying to think of a new way of talking about Ottomanism, because I think it requires more voices to say, here is expansion of Islamicate instead of the narrow vision of it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I think Malcolm would appreciate that too. So the floor is now open. If you have any questions, please feel free to just raise your hand on the Zoom session so that I can see you and feel comfortable. So Sumaya Hoja, you've raised your hand, please.
Many thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Professor Lawrence, what I want to ask about is the implications of when you say modernism everywhere matters, and when you include modern times in your map of Islamicate lands. So in terms of times, you don't, limit it with earlier centuries, etc. What are the implications of that? Because in terms of understanding modernism itself, so we have modernisms, right? That's the first thing that comes to my mind. But the second thing is, does that in a way also brings back the Eurocentrism from another perspective? Can we have our modern times explanation of nostal cultures in the modern times within other perspectives as well? That was the only question that came to my mind, but I really enjoyed the horizons that we've opened to our mind to look at the things exclusively and how we can include the modern discussions within the history of our own cultures as well. That really opened a lot of opportunities in my mind as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that question, Sumaya. It's a wonderful question, and it's one that I've raised myself, and I think Hodgson himself anticipated that the word modern is part of the modern problem. Because modern can be modernity, but it's often assumed to be Western modernity. And it's often also linked with modernism, as if modernism is a certain vocabulary of what it is to be in the 20th and now the 21st century. And so there's been a lot of dispute about that. One of my own students, whose name is Ali Altaf Mia, has written about this and actually he wrote about it. If you just looked up Alimiya and looked up spirit or looked up modernism, he has this wonderful statement where he's actually doing a review of a book. Do you know the name Wael Halak, the scholar Wael Halak from Colombia? Have you heard that name? So he's written many things about modern, but he wrote a book in 2018 called Reforming Modernism, where he argues that it has to be separated from the West and has to be separated from just a singular evolved vocabulary about what it is to be in the present sphere of human history. And what Alamiah says is lacking in Halak's notion of reforming modernism is the ethical space or the ethical spirit or ethos. So it's this ethos that I say is there in Islamicate, which can be modern, but it's modern under the guise of adab. He describes, and this is Alamiah now, not Bruce Lawrence, but Alamiah saying the ethical space exceeds its application. So you have to be able to say, what is the notion of ethos before you apply it in particular circumstance? And his critique of halak is a way of he's not saying halak is wrong. He's just saying that you have to expand the notion of modernism so it includes the ethical spirit or ethos, which is before you apply its importance in any given episode or any given moment. Adab. So adab is, I think, for me, the one term, and obviously you can say there are many different ways, like Islamicate, there are many different ways of defining it, but adab can be both something that's literary, but it also can be something that exposes certain ethical, normative posture in the world, which is as much about beauty and truth as is about practicality.
Thank you. So Toha, you had your hand up before, but if you don't want to ask the question, I will send it over to Ayman. Okay, so Ayman, you can ask your question, please.
All right, thank you. Crystal Lawrence, first of all, thank you for the enlightening lecture. Really was quite illuminating. I wanted to ask about your notions of barzakh logic and adab itself. So my impression from your lecture was that both of them seem to be tied together as expressions with which you articulate the concept of Islamic cosmopolitanism. If so, could you elaborate further on how you yourself use these two terms to describe the Islamicate?
Well, thank you. I can't tell you how many discussions I've had about barzakh and barzakh logic. And some people say, oh, I really like the term fuzzy logic, which goes back to Lutfizadeh. And I mentioned this in the beginning of my book. I say, if you prefer fuzzy logic, then there's Lutfizadeh. And I explain what fuzzy logic is. But fuzzy logic, without going, you didn't ask about it, but it is the precursor to barzakh logic. In other words, in the same way that Islamicate succeeds Muslim and Islamic, barzakh logic succeeds fuzzy logic. And that's not to say that Muslim or Islamic are bad or wrong. It's just that Islamicate is fuller. And the same way of being an additive rather than a reductive or replacing substitute element, I think of barzakh logic as being related to fuzzy logic, because fuzzy logic is that there's no black and white, there's always gray. And you can see this in scientific as well as in literary terms. And I think that's a wonderful insight, and I believe in it and I support it. But I think barzakh logic, to me, is stronger, not just because it has a Quranic anchor, although it does have an anchor, and I can explain that, but because it explains that there can be two absolute opposites, and they can be conjoined by a barrier, which means neither one can be the other, but yet they are adjunctive to each other. Each one is side by side with the other. So in one sense, they're when I talk about in this book, I say the barzakh is both barrier and bridge to connecting with Allah. And I use this term carefully, barrier, because there is a break, there is a separation between, in the same way, and this gets into a very deep conversation. I am not somebody who applauds or applies a scientific exposition of the Holy Quran, but I do think there are certain scientific facts in the Quran that really make logic easier rather than harder. And so one of the points of logic from the Quran is from Surah Al-Rahman. Of course, barzakh also comes up in Surah Mu'minun and Surah Al-Furqan. I don't want to go through a whole class in tafsir because we don't have that much time. But if you just think that one instance in Surat al-Rahman, where you have a reference to barzakh, this is a barzakh which prevents salt water from combining with sweet water. Well, this is a scientific fact that happens. So barzakh is empirically as well as imaginatively constructed in not just the Holy Quran, but in the life of the material world as we see it. So I find this notion of barzakh as both a barrier and a bridge very helpful. And what I try to accent in my book is that Islamicate and the Islamicate cosmos, or the Islamicate cosmos, is itself a bridge. It's a barrier between saying there's no such thing as a simultaneity of, let's say, Islam and Hinduism, or India, Islam and India. Let's just take two different things. That Islam and India are two different things, but there are points where they allied, and there's some points where they merge, but there's always a distinction between Indic. I prefer to use the term Indic and Islamicate. The two are different realms, but there are also points where they merge, and there's both a barrier and a bridge between them. So I find barzakh logic, first of all, because it sounds nice. I have to say there's a poet in me that says barzakh logic, the KH sound and the C sound in barzakh and logic have a rhyme to each other. So it's easier to remember, but I think it's also very important to apply it. The barzakh logic is a way of thinking about differences that are not dissoluble. So the pre-modern period is not the modern period. The primal period is not the axial period, but the two elide, and one has to recognize the bridge between them as well as the barrier that separates them. So that's how I try and use it in my book. And I use it with reference, of course, I just have to say one of my heroes, I have to say I'm guilty, despite Carlyle, I'm guilty of hero worship. And one of my heroes is M.F. Hussain, the artist M.F. Hussain, who himself is an exponent of barzakh logic, because he believes there really is such a thing as an Islamic ethos or an Islamicate world that bridges the other world, including the Indic world, which he knows very well, and the modern European world, which he also experienced well. But he himself, in my view, is an exponent of barzakh logic and does so through art instead of through writing. So thank you for that question.
Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more. If there is one more, please raise your hand. If not, then okay. All right, then in that case, I first of all want to say thank you very much to Professor Lawrence. I hope you stick around for a few minutes as we end. I just want to say, please continue doing what you're doing. I, for one, have been inspired by academics like yourself who are trying to challenge in terms of typographies and terminologies and so forth, just like Hodgson has. It's a way of bringing to the table the need to try to create a vocabulary that is apt in the way that we're trying to describe the phenomena of Islamic studies and Ottoman studies and anything related to that, because one of the challenges we had, which is something that Hodgson has raised himself, is the challenge of language and the challenge of the English medium in particular of speaking about the Islamicate. So it's always pleasing to me to continuously see academics, even now, trying to put this forward to the younger cohort of academics who may not realize that there is a huge challenge taking place regarding language itself. So thank you very much for that. I really do pray that you continue publishing and writing as much as you can. It's really valuable for us. And we really, I'm really pleased about that. So please do continue, and thank you very much. I want to also stress.
Let me just say in response to you and in response to Ayman and Sumaya and others who asked questions or hesitated, that I would welcome seeing whatever you write in response to the Islamicate. We didn't talk about the Persianate, but the larger barzakh logic that I tried to elaborate. So I appreciate your asking me to write more, and I'll try to write more, but I would welcome seeing what you write and hope you write much. Totally agree with you. And yes, you are right. And hopefully we will try to continue that sort of like spirit in that sense. So thank you very much. In that sense, we're going to close up. And once again, I thank Professor Lawrence. What I'll say to the audience is we will end the session now. Professor Lawrence will stay around. We kindly would ask you to leave the session
so that some members of the staff can have a private conversation with Professor Lawrence. If for whatever reason we are forced to remove you from the Zoom session, we apologize, and please do not take that personally. But thank you very much, everyone, once again for being here today. We look forward to seeing you on Thursday, where Yahya Burt will be talking about his new work, and Moneda on, I forget the title, but it's about the idea of Ottoman perceptions of Islam in Britain, in Victoria, Britain. So please, we will send out the link in the emailing list and the posters, so please keep your eye out for that. Once again, thank you very much for everyone for being here today, and Assalamu alaikum, and I hope you guys had a wonderful Eid, those of you who celebrated it last week. Take care.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you, Yaqub.
No worries.